there's a election task force, I guess, the what you would call the intimidating factor at the Pinellas County Sheriff's Department at the elections office. We have 30 Pinellas County Sheriff deputies' vehicles here. This is the Pinellas County Supervisor of Elections Task Force. Now, why would we need 50 Pinellas County Sheriff deputies so you have to ask yourself, why do we need 100 deputies up at the Supervisor of Elections office? Are these deputies being paid? What are they here for? To go through ballots? To eliminate ballots? To mark unmarked ballots? Why do they need this?
Hundreds of non-U.S. citizens were registered to vote illegally in Illinois.
The system's down today
because of a glitch in the keypads at state driver services facilities. In 2017, then Governor Bruce Rauner signed the automatic voter registration bill into law. It requires eligible Illinois citizens applying for or renewing driver's licenses or IDs to be automatically registered to vote. From Secretary of State Jesse White's office blamed a, quote, programming error in the signature pad for accidentally registering the non-citizens as voters.
The individuals who were applying for a driver's license were inadvertently pooled into the automatic voter registration.
It was, in fact, a state error that signed them up to vote.
We discovered an error, and we fixed it, and then we notified the State Board of Elections and the local election authorities.
Republican Representative Tim Butler of Springfield is demanding a House investigation into Jesse White's office.
He may or may not have known about this. I have no idea. But he needs to be held responsible for it. It's his operation that allowed this to happen.
In a written statement, the state GOP chairman called for heads to roll, saying, quote, "It's simply inexcusable that non-citizens voted in Illinois and potentially affected the outcome of elections across the state. Those in the Secretary of State's office who allowed this to happen should be terminated from their employment with the state."
As voters try to cast their last-minute votes, the voter registration system has been up and down in some parts of our state, frustrating thousands of Colorado voters.
Denver 7's Jacqueline Allen is live at the Secretary of State's office to sort all this out. What's going on, Jacqueline?
Well, here's what we know. The statewide voter registration system was down for about 29 minutes this afternoon, starting at about 2:47 this afternoon. It is back up now, but for a short time there, clerks were not able to process some of the mail-in ballots, and they had to wait. Some people cast provisional ballots during that time. Others chose not to.
So we're still working on the actual cause of the issue. We did work to bring up the system again once it did go down. Colorado law does have provisions so that individuals who were in line were able to cast a provisional ballot if they wanted to, or they could choose to wait for it to come back up.
And so were people turned away at any point? And how much of a delay does this cause as far as getting the results back?
No one was turned away. Anyone still had the ability to cast a ballot. So the Colorado law is very clear on that point. No one gets turned away, even if the system is down for a minute or 29 minutes. With respect to results, we already have about 2.4 million ballots that have come in. Those results will be released as soon as the clerks finish processing those, as well as the others that are casting ballots. You'll have initial results by 7:30. Those will probably represent at least 2 million of the ballots that were cast.
All right, thank you so much for joining us. So again, the system was down for 29 minutes, but it is back up and running now.
Comal County election officials are reviewing voter logs to see how many people could have been impacted by a technical issue at the polls on Election Day.
Officials say the tech issues impacted ballots which were cast on Election Day after the poll pads were rebooted. They heard from 3 voters who noticed local races missing, but others may not have known their ballots were incomplete.
We're checking each one, what could have voted versus what voted.
Comal County Clerk Bobby Kep says the company that makes the poll pads where the issue seems to have originated should have notified her sooner and should take some responsibility.
It's part of my duties to make sure that everybody gets what they're supposed to get when they come to vote. And I do take responsibility for that. But in my defense, they need to make it right. They need to make a statement and need to tell everybody what happened.
Kep believes it's up to the candidates to request a do-over. She expects to release more details on the scope of the issue later this week.
We're going to do everything diligently in our power to figure out exactly how many votes were cast that didn't get the opportunity to vote the way they needed to.
No.
How would that happen?
I don't know, it's in the machine. It is not letting me vote for who I want to vote for.
Americans need to have paper ballots marked by hand. Until that system is adopted, every election that goes by is yet another election that foreign governments, hostile foreign governments, including Russia, can hack.
Many have concerns about voting systems with remote access software, and I think we want to make sure that companies no longer sell voting machines that have network capabilities.
Another provision I had in my bill.
We need also to understand supply chains. In December 2019, a study released by Interos, a supply chain monitoring company, showed that 1/5 or 20% of the components in a popular voting machine came from China-based companies. Furthermore, close to 2/3, or actually 59%, of suppliers within that machine's supply chain had locations in either China or Russia.
ESNS equipment, the company Diebold that went out of business that you spoke of. It is important that an auditable paper trail be required for every vote cast. ESNS has stopped selling new voting machines that do not produce an auditable paper record as the primary voting device.
The election industry is far better informed, better supported, and more agile when it comes to cybersecurity threats as a direct result of the Department of Homeland Security's designation of the American election system as critical infrastructure.
For 2020, we have been working closely with jurisdictions seeking to upgrade their voting systems. Older, end-of-life technology is being replaced with certified solutions that produce paper records for auditing and resilience.
To your knowledge, has a foreign state ever successfully breached or hacked any of your vote tallying election machines? Mr. Burt?
No.
Mr. Post?
No.
What then was the primary target of our foreign adversaries in the 2016 election? Mr. Burt?
Well, Ranking Member, I think there are potentially differing public views on that, but what I can say is that, as you asked a minute ago, we've seen no evidence that any of our voting systems have been tampered with in any way.
Mr. Poulos?
I would agree with that statement. We feel the same way. Can't speak to what the primary purpose was of the attacks, but there's, to our knowledge, no evidence on our systems as well.
Well, you guys already answered that. Ms. Mathis, do you know what was attacked during 2016?
Do not have personal awareness of that.
Okay, I believe reports say there were centralized voter registration systems, even one in my home state of Illinois. Where do these centralized state voter registration system databases come from?
Ranking member, it's various depending on the
Do they come from any of your companies?
We do host voter registration systems for a limited number of states, yes.
DEF CON is very unique in that everybody who attends, including press, pays $300 cash to attend. There are no sponsors. It is a fiercely independent spirit on display there. When we got there, we were in fact made to feel pretty welcome, and it turns out that the people in attendance are not the loners, working on behalf of the Russian government, at least none that we saw. People tend to, the tradition there is people coming in who are either employed by big companies helping them to imagine the worst case scenarios that hackers might perpetrate on them, or just independent spirits who do that kind of thing for intellectual curiosity or other motivations. We were there specifically to attend something called the Voting Village, which is something that's gone on for 3 years, and in its third year they had assembled some of the most common voting machines in the country, both systems that are on the front end that you and I use to actually register our vote, and the back end, tabulators and so forth, that you would feed a paper ballot into or that oversee a system. What was so interesting was I assumed coming into it that the big manufacturers, companies like ES&S and Dominion, had provided these machines to the hackers to, field test them. But no, it turns out there's an extremely hostile relationship there, and that ES&S and Dominion and other companies have basically said we don't want to participate, and really have been quite aggressive in saying we don't want to be part of this. So the organizers were reduced to finding these machines on eBay, which right there is pretty terrifying, because it turns out that anybody can buy some of the most common machines in use on eBay. Beyond that, we were seeing Dominion's image cast system. It's a line of tabulators that paper ballots are fed into. That had its guts all over the room. It was not clear to us whether this was the most recent version of the image cast hardware, but it's important to know that Georgia just spent over is about to spend over $100 million on a contract with Dominion to provide image cast hardware to the state in time for the next primaries and for the 2020 election. And yet here these kids were who had opened it up. They said, look, you can pop the front off of it, and here's a port you can get into right here. That's easy. All kinds of stuff that you could certainly do within 6 minutes behind a curtain, much less if you had extra time, because any of these were connected to the web, as we discovered a couple of days before. I mean, the spirit of this event was transparency, trying to get these vulnerabilities out into the world so that I guess the idea is that the companies will be forced to correct them in some way. On the front of each machine was a little post-it that showed off what had been found out by the various hackers. So at one point, the admin password was just sitting there on there, because it turns out that the same admin password applies to multiple machines across the room, and those machines were created in the 2000s, which means that they were in fact created so you can't change that admin password. They're just locked for all time in that way. There does not seem to be any political momentum on some of the bills that are under consideration right now around trying to keep these machines off the internet, or trying to establish some sort of certifiable ballot, paper ballot system, or any of the other things that have been proposed. And so the combination of seeing the incredible vulnerabilities that we saw on display in real time at this event, And the lack of institutional action around the security of the vote, all of that made for an extremely alarming weekend.
You have a reputation for dead people voting, and we're going to go look at just how many dead people voted here. I didn't think we'd have to do that, but we will.
Until our investigation, although long buried, on paper, they were alive and qualified to go to the polls. And in a few cases, records showed the dead actually voting.
The NBC Action News investigation you're about to see is already getting results. Tonight, election officials in Kansas and Missouri are taking action to prevent dead people from casting votes.
Well, to break the story, NBC Action News investigator Russ Patasic sorted through thousands of suspected dead registered voters.
The same records that still showed Emily as a qualified voter for this coming November 2nd election recorded her as actually voting in the presidential elections 2 years ago. But that's impossible because she was cremated 2 months before the election.
November 4th was when she voted. She had died September 13th.
Emily's father says he'd notified elections officials of Emily's lupus and fibromyalgia-related death 2 years ago.
She was quite ill for a long time.
Deceased is even handwritten across her name on 2008 voter logs obtained by NBC Action News.
So it's just a clerical error on our part.
But you were officially notified 2 years ago on these records?
Correct.
But 2 years later, you still have her listed as an active voter, and officially, she's listed as casting a vote.
Right. But she hasn't really casted a vote.
Officials say the voter appeal tab next to Emily's name wasn't torn, indicating although Emily was recorded as voting, no one actually cast an official ballot.
So it was our fault that we missed that.
Here's the death information over here.
Missouri Watchdog analyst and reporter Earl Glenn tipped us to Emily's case and to over 1,900 registered voters in Kansas and more than 4,200 registered voters in Missouri that his review identified as having names and birth dates that match the Social Security death list.
The potential is really big. I think there's a great potential that an election could be thrown fairly easily.
Our investigation identified cases in Johnson and Jackson counties where the dead were not only qualified to vote, records counted them as voting. We've released thousands of suspected dead registered voter names to Missouri and Kansas officials, and like in our review, officials are finding most of the names are false matches, but they confirmed identifying more and more dead registered voters every day over the past week as our investigation escalated.
Welcome back. Tonight we're receiving more context from the Secretary of State on the absentee ballots rejected in the August primary. Some are claiming it's evidence of voter fraud, but election officials say it's proof of preventing that. 10,694 votes in all were tossed out. 6,400 of them for not arriving on time, about 2,000 more because the ballots either were not signed or the signature on the ballot did not match the signature on their voter registration. Some people, though, are focused on that 846 number. Ballots thrown out because the voter had died. Some reports are framing it as people trying to vote illegally, using a dead person's identity. The Secretary of State's office says that is not the case. Take a listen.
The Bureau of Elections receives updates monthly from the Social Security Master Death Index, and we use that information to update the qualified voter file. When these people applied for their absentee ballot, they were alive and everything checked out with their identity, so they were sent one. And then after we received the monthly update, it was flagged in the qualified voter file that they passed away. So when it came time to process and tabulate their ballot on election day, that flag came up. It showed that they had recently died and their ballot was no longer counted.
The The SOS also says that 846 figure was actually smaller than expected. In the November 2016 election, 400,000 fewer people voted absentee than just a few weeks ago, and we had about 1,700 rejected ballots because the voter had passed away.
Protecting the voting process from outside interference is a high priority this election season. In his latest report, Miles O'Brien looks at some of the latest technology being used in Georgia and whether it provides a stronger defense against tampering than the traditional paper ballot. It's part of our ongoing Leading Edge series on science and innovation.
In the world of computer science, they are tensely tracking what the voting machines will do.
Georgia's kind of a petri dish.
Alex Halderman is a professor of computer science at the University of Michigan.
There's a lot more we have to learn about Georgia's election system, and that's going to help inform how to better secure elections, not just in Georgia in November, but across the country for years to come.
He's among a handful of independent election security experts getting unprecedented access to the inner workings of the state's $107 million voting system rolled out earlier this year. Also taking a deep dive, election security white hat hacker Hari Hursti.
They have set up a complicated system which is centralized and doesn't seem to have any safeguards.
This is the poll pad. On Election Day, it is used to check in voters.
Rick Barron is Fulton County's Director of Registration and Elections. He gave me a demo.
It tells whether we issued an absentee by mail ballot, whether somebody's voted early, whether they've voted that absentee ballot, or whether they're still eligible to vote.
Once a voter is deemed eligible, the iPad activates a magnetic card, which in turn unlocks a so-called ballot marking device, or BMD.
This is a pretty complicated way to do something you could do with pen and paper. There are advantages here, right?
Yes. The advantages are puts a true mark on the screen.
When done, the voter prints a ballot. Selections are recorded in human-readable text and in a QR code, which is read and counted by an optical scanner. Georgia's Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, says this is more accurate than pen and paper.
The problem with pen and paper is sometimes you have your instructions on what you're supposed to do, but you end up with spoiled ballots.
Let's go back to Hammer and Scorecard. Are those the names that you just used for those programs? What's being done about it, and how broadly were they used by vote counters in various states?
I think they were very broadly used, but not by the vote counters. They were used by
the forces in the Democratic operatives that had access to these programs through the government access points that they have, and used it illegally to change votes in this country. It's got to be investigated probably by the president's most trusted military intelligence officials who can get into the system and see what was done. But we do have some evidence that that is exactly what happened. And they've used it against other entities in other countries. It's just been turned recently against our own citizens here to change election results. It's absolutely appalling that that can be done. And whether it's called computer glitches or something else, somebody has actually gone into the system and changed voting results.
That's called intervention in our elections, irrespective of I guess if they were Russia or China, we'd refer to them as meddling. But it's intervention, and it's also crooked as hell, rigging this election no matter the jurisdiction, whether it's Michigan, Georgia, wherever it might be. What can we do about it? Because the Department of Justice, I mean, if there's evidence of that program, why not just turn it over to the Justice Department and say, and go to the courts and say, this has got to stop now. Here is the way in which it was done.
Well, we've been trying to get their attention, and we're going to try even harder, and we'll have to put it in a federal lawsuit, apparently, and get as much of it out as we possibly can. We have some excellent witnesses on the issue, but this is coup 5.0, Lou. I mean, there was no reason to think that the Democratic operatives who spent hundreds of millions of dollars creating the Russia hoax, the Steele dossier, taking us through a special counsel operation for 2 years, trying an impeachment hoax, the apocalypse hoax, the obstruction hoax, wouldn't go so far as to create every means of voter fraud they could come up with to steal this election. That's exactly what happens. The president must fight back now in every way, shape, or form. We cannot let this republic be stolen by the Democratic operatives who want to destroy the republic and make it a socialist country where they continue to line their pockets with these backdoor global deals like the Biden laptop from hell exposes.
Tom Fitton, you've pointed out in our discussions that these legislatures are Republican controlled. Who can take that message to them? And precisely how likely is it that they would be receptive to a clean slate of electors who would represent and stand up for the integrity of elections and support the president?
Well, you know, the focus from the media and activists and regular voters and citizens need to be brought to bear here. Certainly the information we're learning from campaign activists on the ground, independent journalists like John Solomon, the work of Judicial Watch should also be brought to bear. I mean, we knew going into this election in Pennsylvania, Lou, there were 800,000 extra names in the rolls in Pennsylvania. Nevada County has 154,000 inactive names on the rolls. Clark County, Nevada, I mean. So we've got this problem of dirty election rolls, mailing and balloting being allowed to draw from them.
And apparently a Republican Party that doesn't demand that those rolls be cleaned up.